Welcome to the worst time to be alive. Hey guys, tonight we're going back, way back, like before anyone invented bread back, before agriculture, before cities, before someone figured out that maybe living in one place might be nicer than wandering around freezing to death. We're talking about the Ice Age, or more specifically, the last glacial maximum, which peaked around 26,000 years ago and didn't really let up until about 19,000 years ago. That's 7,000 years of just cold. Unrelenting, soul-crushing cold. So go ahead and get comfortable. Dim those lights, grab your coziest blanket, maybe put on some socks because we're going to be talking about cold for a while. Let your mind drift back to a time when survival was the only job anyone had. And spoiler alert, most people were pretty bad at it. This is going to be a long one, so settle in. We're spending the next couple hours exploring what it was like to be a human being when the world was essentially one giant freezer and your ancestors were just trying not to become human popsicles. Now, when we talk about the Ice Age, we're not talking about that cute animated movie with the sloth and the mammoth. We're talking about a period that lasted roughly 2.5 million years, with multiple glacial and interglacial periods. But tonight we're focusing on that last big freeze, the one our direct ancestors lived through, the one where glaciers covered about a third of the Earth's land surface. Ice sheets stretched from the North Pole down to where New York City is today. Northern Europe was buried under ice that was miles thick in some places. And if you lived anywhere near these ice sheets, your life was basically one long exercise in not dying. Let's set the scene properly. Imagine a world where winter doesn't end. It just keeps going, year after year after year. The summers aren't really summers, they're just slightly less brutal winters. The temperature during the coldest periods was about 11 degrees Celsius cooler than today on average. That might not sound like much, but it's the difference between I need a sweater and everything is dead or dying and the landscape looks like an alien planet. The sea levels were lower, way lower, because so much water was locked up in ice. We're talking about 400 feet lower than today. Britain wasn't an island. It was connected to mainland Europe by a land bridge called Doggerland, which is now under the North Sea. You could walk from Siberia to Alaska across the Bering Land Bridge, which is exactly what some groups of humans did because apparently some people looked at Ice Age Siberia and thought, you know what would be better? Ice Age Alaska. The landscape was different too. Where there weren't glaciers, there was mostly tundra and grassland. Trees? Not so much. The forest had retreated to small pockets of relatively warmer areas. Instead, you had vast stretches of what they call mammoth steppe, this cold, dry grassland ecosystem that doesn't really exist anymore. It was windy, constantly windy. Dust storms were common because there wasn't much vegetation to hold the soil down. The air was drier, the skies were often gray, and if you've ever experienced a particularly miserable February day that feels like it's sucking the life force out of you, multiply that by several thousand and you're getting close to the vibe. So into this cheerful environment we have our ancestors. Anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, who had evolved in Africa and started spreading out into Europe and Asia. They were sharing the landscape with Neanderthals for a while, until the Neanderthals went extinct around 40,000 years ago, which is a whole separate tragedy we could talk about. But by the time we hit the last glacial maximum, it was mostly just us, along with the animals who were somehow also managing to survive in this frozen hellscape. Let's talk about those animals for a second, because the Ice Age megafauna were both a blessing and a terror. You had woolly mammoths, which were basically elephants that evolved to survive in a climate that would kill a regular elephant in about 10 minutes. They had thick fur, tiny ears to prevent heat loss, and the layer of fat that was up to 4 inches thick. They were everywhere in the northern latitudes, roaming in herds across the mammoth steppe, eating the sparse vegetation. Then you had woolly rhinoceroses, which were exactly what they sound like, rhinos but fluffier and angrier. Cave lions, which were bigger than modern lions and had no particular fear of humans. Cave bears, which were absolutely massive and lived in, you guessed it, caves, which was unfortunate because humans also really liked caves. Giant deer with antlers that could span 12 feet across, which seems excessive but probably made sense to the deer. Reindeer, horses, bison, muskoxen, all of them adapted to the cold, all of them difficult to hunt, and all of them capable of killing you if you messed up. And then there were the predators that weren't megafauna but were still terrifying. Wolves, hyenas, and various large cats that saw humans as at best competitors and at worst dinner. The food chain was not friendly to humans. We weren't at the top yet. We were somewhere in the middle, using our brains to try to outwit creatures that were stronger, faster, and better adapted to the cold than we were. Humans during this period were nomadic hunter-gatherers. They had to be. You couldn't stay in one place because the food moved, and if you didn't move with it, you starved. They traveled in small groups, probably extended family units of maybe 20 to 50 people. Any larger and you couldn't feed everyone. Any smaller and you didn't have enough people to hunt effectively or defend against predators or care for the sick and injured. These weren't crude cavemen grunting at each other, despite what popular culture might suggest. These were people with sophisticated tools, complex language, social structures, art, music, and probably some form of spirituality or religion. They had the same cognitive abilities we have today. If you took a baby from the Ice Age and raised them in the modern world, they'd be perfectly capable of learning calculus, or playing video games, or scrolling through social media. The only difference between them and us is the accumulated knowledge and technology of thousands of generations. But despite being smart, life was hard, really hard. Life expectancy was somewhere in the mid-30s, and that's if you made it past childhood, which about half of people didn't. Infant mortality was brutal. Disease, injury, malnutrition, exposure to the cold, predators, accidents, complications from childbirth, all of these things could kill you and frequently did. If you made it to adulthood, you were tough. You were a survivor. And even then, you probably had broken bones that had healed badly, arthritis, dental problems, and a collection of scars from all the times you almost died but didn't. So what did these people do all day? Well, survival was a full-time job. You had to find food, which meant hunting and gathering. You had to find or create shelter. You had to make and maintain tools and clothing. You had to keep the fire going, because fire was the difference between life and death. You had to process animal hides into leather, sew clothing, gather firewood, cook food, care for children, tend to the sick and injured, keep watch for predators, navigate unfamiliar terrains, and probably 100 other tasks I'm not thinking of.
Let's start with fire, because fire is arguably the most important technology humans had during the Ice Age. Fire kept you warm. Fire cooked your food, making it safer to eat and easier to digest. Fire provided light in the long, dark nights. Fire kept predators away, because most animals are terrified of fire. Fire was where the group gathered, where stories were told, where bonds were formed. Fire was literally the center of human life. But maintaining fire in the Ice Age was not easy. You couldn't just flick a lighter. You had to create fire using friction, either with a bow drill or by striking flint against iron pyrite to create sparks. This takes skill and patience, and dry materials which were often hard to find in a cold, wet environment. Once you had fire, you had to keep it going, because starting a new fire was time-consuming and difficult. Groups probably carried embers with them when they moved, keeping them alive in containers made from bark or horn, feeding them with dry moss or lichen. Firewood was a constant concern. In the tundra environment, trees were scarce. People burned whatever they could find: brush, dried grasses, animal dung, and bones. Yes, bones! Mammoth bones in particular burn quite well once they're dry, and there's archaeological evidence of hearths surrounded by mammoth bones that were clearly used as fuel. Some Ice Age dwellings were partially constructed from mammoth bones, which served as both structural support and a convenient fuel source. The hearth was the heart of the camp. It was where people cooked, worked, socialized, and slept. Archaeological sites from this period show evidence of carefully constructed hearths, often lined with stones to contain the fire and reflect heat. People would have slept in a circle around the fire, huddled together for warmth, probably under piles of animal furs. Speaking of furs, let's talk about clothing, because clothing was the other major technology that allowed humans to survive in the Ice Age. You needed layers, lots of layers.
The people of the Ice Age wore tailored clothing made from animal skins and furs, sewn together with sinew or plant fibers using bone needles. We know they had needles because archaeologists have found them. Delicate little things made from bone or ivory with eyes for threading. The typical outfit probably consisted of an inner layer of softer fur, worn with the fur against the skin for insulation, then an outer layer of tougher hide, worn with the fur facing out to shed wind and moisture. Pants, tunics, boots, mittens, hoods, everything was designed to trap warm air and keep out the cold. Footwear was particularly important because frostbite was a real and constant danger. Boots were probably made from multiple pieces of leather and fur stuffed with dried grass or moss for insulation. Making this clothing was labor-intensive. You had to hunt the animal, skin it carefully to preserve the hide, scrape away all the fat and tissue, stretch and dry the hide, possibly smoke it to preserve it, then cut it into pieces and sew it together. A single outfit probably represented dozens of hours of work. And clothing wore out, got wet, got torn. It needed constant maintenance and repair. There's evidence that people used bone or ivory tools to work hides, making them supple enough to sew. Children had to be dressed warmly too, which was its own challenge because children grow quickly and clothing doesn't. Keeping infants alive in the Ice Age required serious dedication. They had to be kept warm constantly, which probably meant being carried close to their mother's body most of the time, wrapped in furs. Mother's milk was the only food source for the first year or two of life, and malnutrition in the mother meant malnutrition in the infant. Now let's talk about shelter, because you can't just sleep out in the open when it's minus 30 degrees Celsius. Caves were the ideal shelter, and there's a reason we call these people cave dwellers. Caves offered protection from wind, snow, and predators. They maintained a relatively constant temperature. They were dry, or at least drier than outside. If you found a good cave, you stayed there as long as the hunting was good in the area. But caves were limited and often occupied by animals who had the same idea. Cave bears in particular were a problem because they hibernated in caves during winter, which is exactly when humans most needed shelter. There's evidence of humans and cave bears competing for cave space, which must have been terrifying because cave bears were enormous, up to half a ton in weight. Some caves show evidence of both human and bear habitation, though probably not at the same time. When caves weren't available, people built structures. In open areas, they constructed huts using whatever materials were available. In regions with mammoths, they built huts from mammoth bones covered with hides. Some of these structures were surprisingly elaborate, with bones stacked to form walls, covered with animal skins and weighted down with more bones or stones to keep the wind from tearing everything apart. These mammoth bone huts could house multiple families and had hearths in the center. In forested areas, people built huts from wooden poles covered with hides or bark. These were probably similar to the teepees or wigwams used by later hunter-gatherer societies. They were portable enough to be dismantled and carried to a new location when the group moved. The framework could be reused, and only the covering material had to be replaced periodically. Inside these shelters, space was organized around the hearth. There would be areas for sleeping, working, and storage. Tools were kept close at hand. Food was stored in pits or containers. Hides were stored, rolled, or folded. Everything had its place because space was limited and organization meant efficiency, which meant survival. Let's move on to food, because humans have to eat, and eating during the Ice Age was a daily challenge. The diet was primarily meat-based because plant foods were scarce, especially during winter, which lasted most of the year. Humans were persistence hunters, meaning they used their intelligence and endurance to track and exhaust prey over long distances. Hunting large animals like mammoths or bison was a group effort that required coordination, planning, and courage. You couldn't just run up to a mammoth and stab it. You had to drive it into a trap or corner it against a cliff or separate a young or weak individual from the herd. You used spears with stone points
and later spear throwers called atlatls that increased the force and distance you could throw. Some groups used pit traps or drove animals into bogs where they'd get stuck. A successful mammoth hunt could feed a group for weeks, and very little went to waste. The meat was obviously eaten, the fat was rendered for cooking and possibly for lamps. The bones were used for tools, weapons, and fuel. The hide was made for clothing and shelter. The sinew was used for thread. The ivory was carved into tools or art objects. Even the internal organs were eaten or used in some way. Wasting resources was not an option. But hunting large animals was dangerous and unpredictable. Animals fought back. People got trampled, gored, or crushed. Hunting parties sometimes came back with fewer members than they left with, and hunts didn't always succeed. Bad weather, bad luck, or a herd moving out of range could mean no food for days or even weeks.
Smaller animals were easier and safer to hunt. Reindeer, horses, and Arctic hares were common prey. Birds and their eggs were gathered when available. Fish could be caught in rivers and streams using spears, nets, or traps, though fishing was less important in areas where water sources were frozen much of the year. Plant foods, when available, included roots, tubers, nuts, berries, seeds, and edible greens. But during the coldest periods of the Ice Age, plant foods were scarce or absent for much of the year. People had to know which plants were edible, where to find them, and when they were available. This knowledge was crucial and passed down through generations. Preservation of food was important because you couldn't always count on fresh kill. Meat could be dried into jerky, which lasted for months. In the cold climate, meat could also be frozen, naturally refrigerated by the environment. Some groups probably cached food in frozen pits or under snow. Fat was particularly valuable because it provided concentrated calories and could be stored for long periods. Meals were probably simple. Meat roasted over the fire or boiled in skin containers using hot stones. Organs eaten raw or lightly cooked. Bone marrow, rich in fat and nutrients, extracted by cracking bones and eaten with great enthusiasm because it was delicious and calorie-dense. There was no bread, no pasta, no rice, no vegetables most of the year. Just meat, fat, and whatever plant foods could be scrounged up. Malnutrition was common, especially toward the end of winter, when stored food ran out and hunting was difficult. People probably went through cycles of feast and famine. After a successful hunt, everyone ate until they couldn't eat anymore. Between hunts, people rationed what they had and hoped the next hunt came soon. Children, pregnant women, and nursing mothers needed more food, but there wasn't always enough. Some people, especially the elderly or sick, probably ate less so others could survive. Let's talk about water, which is something we take for granted, but was a concern during the Ice Age. In winter, water sources froze. You couldn't just turn on a tap. You had to melt snow or ice, which required fuel for fire, which required time and effort. Eating snow directly was dangerous because it lowered your core body temperature. Clean water was essential because dehydration could kill you just as surely as starvation. In summer, or what passed for summer, water was easier to find in streams and lakes, but you had to be careful because drinking from stagnant water could make you sick. People probably learned through trial and error which water sources were safe. Now, let's drift into the social structure of Ice Age communities, because humans are social creatures and survival depended on cooperation. Family groups were the basic unit. You had parents, children, grandparents if anyone lived that long, aunts, uncles, and cousins. Everyone had a role. Men typically did the hunting, which was the most dangerous job. Women gathered plant foods, processed hides, made clothing, cooked, and cared for children. Children helped with simpler tasks and learned the skills they'd need as adults. But these roles weren't rigid. Everyone did what was necessary. Women probably participated in hunts, especially for smaller animals. Men probably helped with food processing and childcare. Survival required flexibility. Leadership was probably based on competence and experience. The best hunters, the most knowledgeable elders, the most skilled tool makers would have had influence. Decisions were likely made collectively, with input from the group. Conflict had to be resolved peacefully because you couldn't afford to lose members over disputes. Cooperation was survival. Marriage or pair bonding existed, though we don't know exactly what form it took. People probably partnered to raise children and share resources. Incest taboos likely existed to prevent inbreeding, which means groups had to interact with other groups to find partners. This required travel and social networks that extended beyond the immediate family. Trade and interaction between groups was important. People exchanged tools, materials, information, and genes. Shell beads from the coast have been found hundreds of miles inland, showing that people traveled or traded over long distances. Flint from specific quarries was used far from where it was mined. These networks helped spread innovations and knowledge. There's evidence of care for the sick and injured. Skeletons from this period show healed fractures, infections that people survived, individuals with disabilities who lived to adulthood. This means people cared for each other, fed those who couldn't hunt, protected those who couldn't protect themselves. This kind of compassion is deeply human and was essential for group survival. Death was a common presence. Burial practices from this period show that people mourned their dead and treated bodies with care. Some burials included grave goods like tools, ornaments, or food, suggesting a belief in an afterlife or at least a desire to honor the deceased. Bodies were sometimes covered with red ochre, a natural pigment, which might have ritual significance. Some graves were elaborate, with the body positioned carefully and surrounded by objects. Others were simple, just the body in a pit. Infant and child graves are particularly poignant. Small skeletons buried with care, sometimes with toys or ornaments. These were loved children whose deaths were mourned. The high rate of child mortality meant that most parents lost at least one child, probably more. Grief was a constant companion. Let's talk about tools, because tools were what separated humans from most other animals. Ice Age tools were sophisticated and specialized. The main material was stone, especially flint, which could be knapped into sharp edges. People made hand axes, scrapers, knives, spear points, and burns, which were used for carving bone and antler. Tool-making was a skilled craft. You had to know which stones worked best, how to strike them to create the right flakes, how to shape and sharpen the edges. A good tool maker was valuable to the group. Bad tools meant inefficiency, which meant less food, which meant death. Bone and antler were also used extensively. Needles for sewing, owls for punching holes in leather, harpoons for fishing, spear points, and handles for stone tools. Antler was particularly useful because it's hard, but not brittle. It could be carved and shaped using stone tools. Weapons were essential. Spears were the primary hunting weapon, made from wooden shafts with stone or bone points. The atlatl, or spear thrower, was developed during this period and dramatically increased the range and power of thrown spears. Some groups might have used bolas, weighted throwing weapons that entangled the legs of running prey. People also made tools for making tools. They had specialized stones for knapping, bone tools for hide processing, and containers made of bark, leather, or carved wood for storing and carrying materials. Organization and preparation meant the difference between success and failure. Art and symbolic expression existed during the Ice Age, which tells us these were people with rich inner lives, not just survival machines. Cave paintings from this period are famous, particularly those in France and Spain. These paintings depict animals, mostly, rendered with surprising accuracy and artistic skill. Bison, horses, deer, mammoths, and predators like lions. The painters used natural pigments like ochre, charcoal, and manganese oxide. They painted by torchlight deep in caves, in places that were difficult and dangerous to reach. Why did they make this art? We don't really know. Maybe it was religious or spiritual, perhaps related to hunting magic. Maybe it was educational, teaching young people about the animals they'd hunt. Maybe it was simply aesthetic, humans expressing their creativity. Or maybe it was all of these things. The art is beautiful and mysterious, and it connects us to these ancient people in a profound way. Portable art existed too. Small sculptures carved from bone, ivory, or stone, often depicting animals or female figures. The Venus figurines, small statuettes of women with exaggerated breasts and hips, have been found across Europe and into Russia. Their purpose is debated. Fertility symbols? Mother goddesses? Pornography? Self-portraits? We don't know. But someone took the time to carve them, which means they had meaning. Jewelry existed too. Beads made from shells, stones, teeth, and bones have been found at Ice Age sites. People adorned themselves, which suggests vanity or social status, or simply a desire to be beautiful even in a harsh world. Someone sat by a fire with a bone needle and thread, carefully stringing beads, making something not strictly necessary for survival, but necessary for being human.
The daily grind of not dying. Let's get into the actual day-to-day routine of living during the Ice Age, because survival wasn't just about the big dramatic moments like mammoth hunts. Most of life was tedious, repetitive work that had to be done every single day, or people died. Glamorous, right? The day probably started before dawn, because daylight was precious and you couldn't afford to waste it, especially during winter when days were short. Someone, probably whoever was on watch duty during the night, would have kept the fire going. If the fire went out, that was a crisis. Restarting it consumed time and resources, and in the meantime, everyone was cold and vulnerable. People woke up stiff and sore, because sleeping on the ground under piles of fur wasn't exactly like a memory foam mattress. They probably had aches and pains from injuries that never healed properly, arthritis from the constant cold and damp, dental problems because their teeth were used as tools and dental hygiene wasn't a thing. But you got up anyway because work needed doing. Breakfast, if there was food available, was probably leftovers from the previous night's meal. Cold meat, dried berries if anyone had them, maybe some bone marrow scraped from yesterday's bones. You ate what was available and didn't complain because complaining didn't create food. Then the group would split up for the day's tasks. Hunting parties would leave, taking their weapons and whatever men were healthy enough to walk and fight. These expeditions could last hours or even days, depending on where the herds were. Tracking was a crucial skill. Hunters had to read the landscape, follow tracks, interpret signs that told them where animals had passed and how long ago. A broken twig, disturbed snow, droppings, these were all clues. The hunters who stayed behind, along with women and older children, would work on other essential tasks. Hides needed constant attention. Fresh hides from recent kills had to be fleshed, which meant scraping away all the fat and tissue. This was done with stone scrapers, and it was hard, physical labor. If you didn't do it properly, the hide would rot or become stiff and unusable. After fleshing, hides were stretched and dried, either on the ground, staked out with wooden pegs, or on frames made from branches. Some hides were smoked to preserve them and make them more pliable. The smoke from certain woods also kept insects away, which was important because flies and other pests were a problem during warmer months. Tanning was a more advanced process that some groups practiced. This involved treating the hide with animal brains, fat, or urine to break down the fibers and make the leather soft and supple. Yes, urine. The ammonia in urine helped with the tanning process, so someone's job was to collect urine and work it into animal hides. Think about that the next time you complain about your job. While some people worked on hides, others gathered firewood, which was a never-ending task. Wood was scarce in many areas, so people collected whatever would burn. Dried brush, animal dung, bones, any combustible material. Children probably helped with this, learning early that contributing to the group was essential for survival. Tool maintenance was a constant job. Stone tools became dull with use and had to be resharpened or replaced. This required skill and patience. Bone needles broke and had to be replaced. Spears were damaged in hunts and needed new points. Clothing tore and had to be mended. Nothing lasted forever, and everything required maintenance. Food preparation was labor-intensive. Butchering an animal wasn't like unlapping a package from the grocery store. You had to skin it, gut it, separate the meat from the bones, decide what to eat now and what to preserve for later. Internal organs had to be cleaned if you were going to eat them, which you probably were because they're nutritious and wasting food was not an option. Cooking was simple but required attention. Meat was roasted on sticks over the fire, boiled in containers, or baked in pits lined with hot stones. Boiling was useful because it made tough meat tender and allowed people to make soups or stews that could feed more people with less meat. The containers used for boiling were probably made from leather or the stomach lining of animals, which could hold liquid if suspended over a fire or filled with hot stones. Water had to be collected and melted if it was frozen. Containers were made from leather, bark, or hollowed-out wood. Clay pottery hadn't been invented yet, so there were no ceramic pots. Everything was organic materials that degraded over time, which is why archaeologists have a harder time finding evidence of daily life from this period compared to later periods with pottery. Childcare was a full-time job in itself. Infants had to be fed, kept warm, kept clean, and carried everywhere because they couldn't walk. Toddlers had to be watched constantly to keep them from wandering off, falling in the fire, or being carried away by predators. Older children were more independent, but still needed supervision and teaching. Education was informal but constant. Children learned by watching and imitating adults. A girl would watch her mother scrape hides and eventually try it herself. A boy would watch his father knap flint and practice on scraps. Older children were taught to identify edible plants, track animals, read weather signs, navigate by landmarks, and 100 other skills necessary for survival. There were no schools, no books, no formal lessons. Knowledge was passed down orally through stories, songs, and demonstrations. Stories were probably a major part of life. After the evening meal, when everyone was gathered around the fire, people told stories. These weren't just entertainment, though they were that too. Stories conveyed important information. They taught moral lessons, explained natural phenomena, preserved history, and reinforced social bonds. The best storytellers were valued because they kept the culture alive.
Music probably existed too. Archaeological evidence includes bone flutes from this period, so people made music. Singing, drumming on hollow logs or stretched hides, playing simple instruments. Music brought people together, lifted spirits, and made the long, dark nights more bearable. Social interaction was crucial for mental health. Humans are social creatures, and isolation drives us crazy. Even in small groups, people needed companionship, conversation, play, and affection. Grooming each other's hair, helping with tasks, sharing food. These were all ways people bonded and maintained group cohesion. But social tension existed too. Personality conflicts, competition for status or mates, disagreements about group decisions. These had to be resolved without violence because losing group members was catastrophic. Probably there were social mechanisms for conflict resolution, maybe mediation by elders or group discussions. Exile was likely a punishment for serious offenses, and being exiled from the group was essentially a death sentence. Mating and reproduction were complicated. Women of childbearing age were valuable because children ensured the group's future. But pregnancy was dangerous, childbirth even more so. Without modern medicine, complications could kill mother and child. Hemorrhaging, infection, obstructed labor, these were all potential death sentences.
Women who survived multiple births were tough and lucky. Pregnancy itself was challenging. Malnutrition during pregnancy led to smaller, weaker babies with higher mortality rates. Pregnant women needed more calories, but food was often scarce. The group had to support pregnant and nursing women, which meant others had to work harder to compensate. Infants were breastfed for several years because there was no alternative food source. This provided complete nutrition, but also meant women spent much of their adult lives either pregnant or nursing. Birth spacing was probably longer than in modern times, partly due to extended breastfeeding, which suppresses ovulation, and partly due to lower nutrition, which affected fertility. Children who survived infancy faced constant dangers: disease, malnutrition, accidents, predators, exposure to the cold. About half of children died before reaching adulthood. Those who survived were tougher and more resilient for it, shaped by a childhood that was equal parts play and survival training. Let's talk about disease and injury, because the Ice Age was not a healthy time to be alive. Without modern medicine, even minor infections could become life-threatening. A cut that got infected could lead to sepsis and death. Broken bones could heal badly, leaving people with chronic pain and limited mobility. Dental abscesses were agonizing and could spread infection to the bloodstream. Parasites were common. Intestinal worms, lice, fleas, all of these plagued Ice Age humans. While parasites rarely killed directly, they contributed to malnutrition and weakened immune systems. People probably suffered from chronic low-level infections that sapped their energy and shortened their lives. Zoonotic diseases, diseases transmitted from animals to humans, were a constant risk. Humans lived in close proximity to animals, hunted them, butchered them, wore their skins. This exposed them to various pathogens. Some diseases that originated in animals likely jumped to humans during this period, though without written records, we can't know specifics. Malnutrition led to various deficiency diseases: scurvy from lack of vitamin C, rickets from lack of vitamin D, anemia from iron deficiency. These conditions weakened people and made them more susceptible to other illnesses. Injuries from hunting were common. Being trampled by a mammoth, gored by a bison, mauled by a cave bear, these were occupational hazards. Some people survived these injuries, as evidenced by healed fractures and skeletal remains. This suggests that groups cared for injured members, splinted broken bones, treated wounds, and fed people who couldn't feed themselves during recovery. Pain management was probably limited to herbal remedies if people had figured out which plants had analgesic properties. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Certain plants have anti-inflammatory or pain-relieving properties, but we don't know how much Ice Age people knew about medicinal plants. Trial and error over generations probably led to some knowledge passed down orally. Frostbite and hypothermia were constant risks. Fingers, toes, noses, ears, these extremities were vulnerable to freezing. Mild frostbite caused pain and blistering. Severe frostbite led to tissue death and potentially amputation of digits. Hypothermia occurred when core temperature dropped too low. Symptoms included confusion, slurred speech, loss of coordination, and eventually unconsciousness and death. Staying warm and dry was literally a matter of life and death. Mental health was probably another challenge, though we can only speculate. Seasonal affective disorder from long dark winters, depression from constant stress and grief, PTSD from traumatic events, anxiety about survival. Humans have the same brains and emotional range as people today, so Ice Age people likely experienced these conditions, but they had no therapy, no medication, only the support of their group and whatever coping mechanisms they developed. Let's drift over to the concept of time and seasons, because Ice Age humans had to track time to survive. They needed to know when herds would migrate,
when fish would spawn, when certain plants would be available. This required observation and memory passed down through generations. The moon was probably used to track time. Lunar cycles are obvious and regular, roughly 29 days. Tallying notches on bones or sticks could track days or lunar months. Some archaeological artifacts show series of marks that might be lunar calendars, though this is debated. Seasonal changes, though subtle during the Ice Age, still occurred. The angle of the sun, the length of days, the behavior of animals, these were all cues. Experienced hunters and gatherers knew that certain events happened in sequence. After the ice melted came the spring migration. After the migration came the berry season. After the berries came the nut harvest. After the nuts came winter, and the cycle repeated. Navigation was crucial for nomadic groups. They had to know how to get from one place to another, where water sources were, where caves provided shelter, where the best hunting grounds were. This knowledge was mental maps passed down and updated through generations. Landmarks like distinctive rocks, mountains, rivers, and coastlines were memorized. The stars were probably used for navigation as well, particularly the North Star, which stayed fixed while others rotated.
The long winter that never ended. The psychological weight of living through an ice age that lasted for thousands of years is something we can barely imagine. Think about how you feel after a particularly long gray winter when spring seems like it's never going to arrive. Now multiply that by generations. Your grandparents told stories about cold. Your parents knew only cold. You've only ever known cold. And your children will know cold, and their children. There's no end in sight. The world has always been this way, and as far as anyone can tell, it will always be this way. This kind of existential bleakness had to affect people. The lack of sunlight during winter months, which in northern latitudes meant the sun barely rose above the horizon for weeks or months, would have caused vitamin D deficiency and seasonal depression in modern terms. But these people didn't have modern terms. They just knew that winter made people tired, sad, irritable. They knew that some people didn't make it through winter, not because they starved, but because they seemed to give up. The elderly were particularly vulnerable. Once someone became too old or infirm to contribute to the group's survival, their position became precarious. Some groups probably practiced senicide, the abandonment or killing of the elderly when they became a burden. This sounds horrific to us, but in a world where one extra mouth to feed could mean starvation for children, these decisions had a brutal logic. An elder might even choose to walk away from the group, knowing their death would mean more food for the young. The concept of sacrifice, of one person dying so others could live, was probably understood and accepted in a way that seems alien to us. Modern society tries to preserve every life as long as possible. Ice Age society couldn't afford that luxury. Life was cheap because death was everywhere, and survival of the group mattered more than survival of any individual. Let's talk about violence between human groups, because resources were limited and competition was fierce. When two groups encountered each other, it could go several ways. They might trade, exchange information, arrange marriages. Or they might fight, because the other group represented competition for scarce hunting grounds. Evidence of violence from this period exists. Skeletons with weapon wounds, mass graves suggesting conflict, defensive structures around some settlements. Humans have always been capable of violence against their own species, and the Ice Age was no different. Raids on other groups to steal food, tools, or women probably occurred. Territorial disputes over the best hunting areas or shelter locations had to be settled somehow. But cooperation also occurred. Groups that traded and intermarried were stronger than isolated groups. Information networks meant someone might know where herds were migrating or where a cave bear had vacated a den. Genetic evidence shows that Ice Age populations weren't completely isolated. There was gene flow between groups, which means people were meeting, mating, and sharing DNA. The extinction of Neanderthals around 40,000 years ago, well before the last glacial maximum, but still during the Ice Age, might have involved competition with modern humans. We know humans and Neanderthals interbred,
because most people today carry some Neanderthal DNA, but we also know Neanderthals went extinct while humans survived. Whether this was due to superior technology, better social organization, disease, or active conflict is still debated. Probably it was a combination of factors, but the end result was that humans were the last hominid species left standing, alone in a frozen world. Let's move into the spiritual and religious life of Ice Age people, which is difficult to discuss because we have limited evidence. But humans seem to have an innate tendency towards spirituality, towards seeking meaning beyond the physical world, and Ice Age people almost certainly had beliefs about the supernatural.
Burial practices suggest belief in an afterlife, or at least respect for the dead. Bodies were positioned carefully, sometimes in fetal positions, perhaps symbolizing rebirth. Grave goods suggest people thought the dead needed items in whatever came next. Red ochre, often used in burials, might have symbolized blood and life. The care taken in burials shows these people grieved and honored their dead, which suggests emotional complexity and possibly religious feeling. Cave art might have had spiritual significance. Some caves show evidence of being used for rituals rather than habitation. The paintings are often in deep, difficult-to-reach chambers, which suggests they weren't just decoration. Perhaps they were part of initiation ceremonies, vision quests, or hunting magic rituals. The handprints found in some caves, created by blowing pigment around a hand pressed to the wall, feel deeply personal, like someone saying, "I was here, I existed." Shamanism probably existed in some form. Shamans are religious specialists found in hunter-gatherer societies worldwide, people who claim to communicate with the spirit world through trance states. Some Ice Age art has been interpreted as depicting shamanic visions, particularly abstract geometric patterns that resemble what people see during altered states of consciousness. Whether through meditation, rhythmic drumming, sleep deprivation, or psychoactive plants, some Ice Age people probably experienced and valued these altered states. The natural world was probably seen as inhabited by spirits. Animals, especially powerful or dangerous ones like bears and lions, might have been seen as sacred or as having spiritual significance. The success or failure of hunts could be attributed to pleasing or angering these spirits. Natural phenomena like thunder, lightning, earthquakes, and auroras might have been seen as messages from the spirit world. Death would have been a constant companion, and people must have developed ways to cope with grief and loss. Ritual mourning, storytelling about the deceased, belief in reunion after death, these are all ways humans across cultures deal with mortality. Ice Age people probably had their own versions of these coping mechanisms. Fear of the dark was probably more than psychological. Darkness meant vulnerability to predators. The night was when cave lions hunted, when wolves prowled, when you couldn't see danger approaching. Fire provided protection, but fire could go out. The long polar nights in northern latitudes, where the sun didn't rise for weeks or months, must have been psychologically devastating. Auroras, the northern lights, would have been visible in northern latitudes and must have been awe-inspiring and perhaps terrifying to people who didn't understand them. These shimmering curtains of green and red light dancing across the sky could have been interpreted as spirits, gods, or omens. Now let's talk about migration and travel, because Ice Age humans were some of the greatest travelers in human history. During the last glacial maximum, humans spread to nearly every corner of the globe accessible by foot. They crossed the Bering Land Bridge into the Americas. They reached Australia, which required sea voyages even during low sea levels. They colonized remote islands. They survived in environments from tropical forests to Arctic tundra. This wanderlust, this drive to see what's beyond the next hill, was essential for survival.
When resources ran low in one area, you moved to another. When herds migrated, you followed. When climate shifts made an area uninhabitable, you found somewhere new. The ability to adapt to new environments was humanity's superpower. But migration was dangerous. Traveling through unknown terrain meant not knowing where water was, where shelter could be found, where predators lurked. Groups probably sent scouts ahead to explore, risking their lives to find safe routes. Some groups didn't make it. They starved, froze, were killed by animals or hostile humans, or simply vanished without a trace. The people who crossed into the Americas via the Bering Land Bridge sometime before the last glacial maximum peaked were incredibly brave or incredibly desperate, or both. They walked from Siberia through a frozen wasteland into Alaska, and then down through an ice-free corridor into the rest of North and eventually South America. Within a few thousand years, humans had spread from Alaska to Patagonia. That's an astounding achievement, covering thousands of miles through diverse and often hostile environments. These migrations weren't organized expeditions, they were probably gradual movements. Groups following game or looking for better hunting grounds, each generation moving a little further. Over centuries, this resulted in continent-spanning dispersals, but each individual group was just trying to survive.
Language was crucial for human success. The ability to communicate complex ideas, share knowledge, coordinate activities, and pass down information through generations gave humans a massive advantage. Ice Age humans spoke languages as complex and sophisticated as any modern language, with grammar, vocabulary, idioms, and probably regional dialects. But these languages are lost forever. They left no written records because writing hadn't been invented. We can only imagine what they sounded like, what words they used, what metaphors and expressions colored their speech. Every Ice Age language that existed is now extinct, replaced by daughter languages that evolved over thousands of years. The diversity of languages suggests that groups were sometimes isolated from each other for long periods, allowing their speech to diverge. But the presence of loanwords and shared vocabulary suggest contact and trade between groups. Language families probably diverged and spread with human migrations, but tracing these relationships is difficult without written records. Music and rhythm probably transcended language barriers. A drum beat, a melodic line played on a flute, these could communicate emotion without words. Dance might have been important too, both as social bonding and as religious ritual. The human body moving rhythmically to music is something universal across cultures, and Ice Age people almost certainly danced around their fires. Let's talk about sex and gender roles, because Ice Age society had to reproduce to survive, and this involved complex social arrangements. Most evidence suggests a division of labor along gender lines, with men hunting large game and women gathering plants and caring for children. But these weren't rigid categories. Women probably participated in hunts, especially for smaller game. Men probably helped with food processing and childcare. Some individuals might not have fit neatly into male or female categories. Third gender or non-binary individuals exist in many traditional cultures, often holding special social or religious roles. Whether such individuals existed in Ice Age societies, we can't know for certain, but given their presence across diverse human cultures, it seems likely. Sexual orientation was probably as varied as it is today. Same-sex attraction is documented across cultures and even in other animal species. So Ice Age people almost certainly included gay, lesbian, and bisexual individuals. How these orientations were viewed or accommodated by their societies, we can only speculate. Monogamy, polygamy, polyandry, group marriage, all of these relationship structures exist in various human societies, and Ice Age groups probably experimented with different arrangements. What mattered was successful reproduction and child rearing.
However that was achieved within the group's social structure was probably acceptable. Adolescence was probably shorter than in modern times. Puberty triggered the transition to adulthood, and teenagers were expected to contribute fully to the group's survival. Girls married young, probably soon after menarche, because female fertility was valuable. Boys had to prove themselves as hunters before being fully accepted as men, which might have involved initiation rituals or tests of courage. Menstruation would have been managed somehow, probably with absorbent materials like moss or soft leather. Women probably experienced fewer periods than modern women because of extended breastfeeding, pregnancy, and lower body fat percentages from physical activity and periodic malnutrition. But menstrual blood was probably seen as powerful or dangerous in some cultures, given its association with fertility and life. Pregnancy outside of pair bonds might have been problematic because children needed two parents or at least a supportive extended family to survive. Single mothers would have struggled unless the group helped support them. This might have led to social pressure for women to remain with partners or to form new partnerships quickly if widowed. Rape probably occurred, as it does in all human societies, though how it was punished varied. In a small group where everyone knew everyone, rape would have been a serious crime that disrupted social cohesion. Rapists might have been exiled, killed, or forced to provide compensation to the victim and her family. But without written laws, we can only speculate about how sexual violence was addressed.
When the world finally began to warm. Around 19,000 years ago, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the climate began to shift. The ice sheets started to retreat. Temperatures crept upward, maybe a degree every few centuries. For the people living through it, this change would have been nearly invisible. But over generations, differences became noticeable. Summers lasted slightly longer. Some winters were less brutal. Tree lines moved northward. New plant species appeared in areas that had been barren tundra. This warming period, called the late glacial interstadial, was interrupted by cold snaps and reversals. The Younger Dryas, a sudden return to glacial conditions around 12,800 years ago, lasted about 13 centuries before warming resumed. So it wasn't a smooth transition. The world warmed, then cooled again, then warmed more. People who thought conditions were improving saw winters return with a vengeance. But overall, the trend was toward a warmer world. And this presented both opportunities and challenges for human populations. The megafauna that humans had relied on for food began to struggle. Mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave bears, giant deer. These cold-adapted animals found themselves in a changing world where their habitats were shrinking. Forests expanded, replacing the mammoth steppe grasslands. The animals that thrived in open grasslands had nowhere to go. Human hunting probably contributed to megafauna extinction too. The combination of climate change and hunting pressure was devastating. One by one, Ice Age megafauna species went extinct. The last mammoths on mainland areas died out around 10,000 years ago, though small populations survived on isolated islands for several millennia. The last woolly mammoths on Wrangel Island in the Arctic Ocean died around 4,000 years ago, which is mind-blowing because that's after the pyramids were built. The extinction of these animals changed human life dramatically. Large game hunts that could feed a group for weeks were no longer possible. Humans had to adapt to hunting smaller, faster animals like deer and wild boar. This required different strategies and technologies. The bow and arrow, developed during this transition period, was better suited for hunting small game than spears were. Fishing became more important as rivers and lakes became more productive in the warmer climate. Fish traps, nets, hooks, and harpoons were developed or improved. Shellfish gathering along coasts provided reliable protein. The ocean, rising as glaciers melted, created new coastal environments rich in marine life. Plant foods became more abundant and diverse as forests and grasslands expanded. Nuts, berries, roots, seeds, these became a larger part of the diet.
Humans became less dependent on meat, which was fortunate because large game was becoming scarce. This dietary shift required new knowledge and new tools for processing plant foods. The warming climate allowed human populations to expand. More food meant more people could be supported. Groups grew larger. Some groups began staying in one place longer instead of constantly migrating, because resources in some areas were now abundant enough to support semi-permanent settlements. This was the beginning of a transition toward agriculture, though that wouldn't fully develop for several millennia. But the seeds were being planted, so to speak. People noticed that plants grew where seeds fell. They noticed that certain areas were particularly productive. They began, slowly, to manipulate their environment rather than just adapting to it. The Younger Dryas cold snap, that sudden return to Ice Age conditions, might have accelerated the development of agriculture. When the climate deteriorated and wild food became scarce again, people who had been relying on abundant wild plants suddenly faced scarcity. Some groups might have started deliberately planting and tending crops as a way to ensure food supply. This is one theory for why agriculture developed in the Fertile Crescent around this time.
But not all groups adopted agriculture. Many continued as hunter-gatherers for thousands more years, and some groups remained hunter-gatherers into the modern era. Agriculture isn't inherently superior. It's a different survival strategy with its own advantages and disadvantages. It allows higher population densities, but requires more labor and creates dependence on crops that can fail. The end of the Ice Age fundamentally transformed the human experience. The world became more hospitable, more diverse, more productive. Human population grew from probably a few million during the glacial maximum to tens of millions as the climate warmed. New technologies developed. Social structures became more complex. Trade networks expanded. Art and culture flourished in new ways. But it wasn't a paradise. Humans still faced disease, injury, conflict, and death. Life was still hard. Life expectancy increased, but was still short by modern standards. Most people still died young. Most children still didn't reach adulthood. The difference was that survival became slightly more achievable, success slightly more common. Let's talk about the psychological shift that might have occurred as the Ice Age ended. For thousands of years, humans had lived in a world that was harsh and unchanging. The cold was eternal. Survival was a daily struggle. But as the world warmed, hope became possible. Maybe next year would be better. Maybe the herds would return. Maybe the children would survive winter. This shift from grinding survival to cautious optimism might have changed human culture in profound ways. Stories probably changed. Instead of just stories about survival and endurance, maybe stories about triumph and success became more common. Heroes who succeeded rather than just surviving. Gods who rewarded virtue rather than just capricious spirits who had to be appeased. This is speculation, but it's interesting to consider how environmental conditions shape culture and worldview. The development of more permanent settlements changed social dynamics. In nomadic groups, you can't accumulate much property because you have to carry everything. But once people settled, possessions became possible. Storage containers, furniture, larger tool collections. And with possessions came inequality. Some people had more than others. Some people were better at accumulating resources. Social hierarchies became more pronounced. Leadership became more formalized. In nomadic groups, leaders led by example and consensus. But in settled communities, leaders needed to coordinate activities, resolve disputes, organize defense against raiders. This created roles for chiefs, elders, councils. Power structures emerged that hadn't existed before. Warfare probably increased as populations grew and competed for good land. Defending a settlement in fields from raiders became necessary. Walls were built around some settlements. Weapons became more sophisticated. Warriors became a specialized role rather than just hunters who fought when necessary. Trade expanded dramatically as settlements specialized in producing certain goods. A group with access to good flint traded tools to groups who had better fishing or better farming.
Trade routes stretched hundreds of miles. Exotic goods like shells, obsidian, and amber traveled far from their sources. This created economic interdependence between groups. Religion probably became more organized. Shamans evolved into priests. Temporary ritual sites evolved into permanent temples. Ancestor worship might have become more important as people stayed in one place and buried their dead nearby. Gods associated with agriculture, weather, and fertility became important as people depended on crops. Human sacrifice, which is found in many later cultures, might have originated during this period. In times of crisis, crop failure, or disaster, desperate people might have offered human lives to appease angry gods. This sounds horrific, but from their perspective, it made sense. If the gods controlled the weather and crops, and the crops were failing, maybe a dramatic sacrifice would change the gods' minds. Art became more diverse as people had more time and resources. Pottery was invented, which was a huge advance for cooking and storage. Textiles were developed, weaving plant fibers into cloth. Jewelry became more elaborate. Architecture became more sophisticated as people built larger and more permanent structures. But let's not romanticize this period. The end of the Ice Age was also marked by violence, upheaval, and suffering. Some groups thrived, while others perished. Some people became wealthy, while others became slaves. Inequality increased. Power concentrated. The seeds of civilization were being planted, but so were the seeds of oppression, exploitation, and war.
The deep cold of memory. Let's drift now into something more contemplative, because we're getting near the end of our journey through the Ice Age, and it's worth considering what this period means for us today. The Ice Age shaped humanity in fundamental ways. The people who survived it were our ancestors, and we carry their genes, their resilience, their adaptability. Every human alive today is descended from people who endured the Ice Age. That's something worth thinking about. Your ancestors, however many generations back, survived conditions that would kill most of us within days. They were tough in ways we can barely comprehend. They endured cold, hunger, pain, loss, and kept going because stopping meant death. This isn't meant to romanticize suffering. The Ice Age was horrible, and nobody should have to live that way. But there's something profound about recognizing that we come from survivors, from people who refuse to give up no matter how bad things got. The Ice Age also shaped human psychology in ways we're still discovering. Our fear of darkness, our attraction to fire, our need for social connection, our ability to endure hardship, these might all be adaptations from that period, where animals adapted for survival in harsh conditions, even though most of us now live in climate-controlled houses and never miss a meal. Our brains developed during periods of scarcity, which is why we overeat when food is abundant, why we crave fatty and sugary foods, why we find it so hard to resist immediate gratification. These are survival mechanisms that made sense during the Ice Age, but cause problems in the modern world of abundance. Our social behaviors also reflect Ice Age origins. We form tight-knit groups with sharp boundaries between us and them. We're suspicious of strangers. We're loyal to family and tribe. We value courage, generosity, and cooperation within our group. These traits helped small bands of humans survive, but they also lead to tribalism, xenophobia, and conflict in modern diverse societies. The stories we tell still echo Ice Age themes: heroes facing impossible odds, journeys through dangerous lands, struggles against monsters and nature, triumph through courage and cunning. These are Ice Age stories, stories that our ancestors told around fires 20,000 years ago, updated with modern settings, but fundamentally the same. Our fascination with survival stories, post-apocalyptic fiction,
and tales of endurance in harsh conditions, these reflect deep cultural memory of the Ice Age. We're drawn to these stories because they resonate with something primal in us, some inherited memory of when survival was uncertain and every day was a struggle. The warming that ended the Ice Age wasn't the end of climate challenges for humanity. The Younger Dryas brought severe cold back. Later, there were warm periods and cool periods, droughts and floods. Medieval Warm Period, Little Ice Age. These are more recent examples of climate variability that affected human civilization. But none of these matched the severity of the glacial maximum. Today, we face climate change again, but this time it's warming caused by human activity. The irony isn't lost. Our ancestors survived an ice age through adaptability, intelligence, and cooperation. Now their descendants have altered the global climate through our success, our numbers, our technology. The challenges we face are different but equally serious. The lessons of the Ice Age might be relevant. Adaptation is essential. Cooperation beats competition. Short-term thinking leads to disaster. Resources must be managed carefully. These are things Ice Age humans understood instinctively because their lives depended on it. We modern humans, insulated from immediate consequences, have to learn these lessons consciously. The Ice Age also teaches us about resilience. Humans survived conditions that seemed unsurvivable. When resources ran low, they moved or adapted. When megafauna went extinct, they found new food sources. When climate changed, they changed with it. We're descendants of survivors, and we carry that capacity for resilience within us. But we also carry capacity for short-sightedness, for depleting resources, for conflict over scarcity. Ice Age humans sometimes made decisions that harmed their long-term survival, contributing to megafauna extinction, overhunting certain areas, engaging in violence with other groups. We inherited those tendencies too. The archaeological record of the Ice Age is fragmentary. Most evidence of human life from that period is gone, degraded, lost. We have stone tools because stone lasts. We have cave paintings in protected environments. We have occasional burials where bones survived, but the vast majority of Ice Age human experience left no physical trace. The songs they sang, the stories they told, the love and laughter and tears, all of it gone, except for what we can infer. This should make us humble about our own time. What will survive from our era 20,000 years from now? Plastic, probably. Some stone and concrete structures. Maybe some very durable digital storage media if anyone knows how to read it. But most of what we consider important, our books, our art, our recorded knowledge, will be gone unless carefully preserved. The Ice Age humans didn't know they were living in an Ice Age. They didn't have a global perspective. They just knew the world was cold and survival was hard. They didn't know the ice would eventually retreat, that their descendants would live in a warmer world with agriculture and cities and technology beyond imagining. They just lived day by day, doing their best to survive. Similarly, we don't know what the future holds. We can't know how our descendants will look back on our time. Will they see us as primitive, as wise, as the generation that solved climate change, or the generation that failed to act? We can't know. We can only do our best with the knowledge and resources we have. The Ice Age ended roughly 11,700 years ago, when the Younger Dryas cold snap finally gave way to sustained warming that led to the current interglacial period, the Holocene. Suddenly, geologically speaking, the world became warm and hospitable. Forests expanded, animals flourished, human populations exploded, agriculture developed independently in multiple regions, civilization arose.
But the Ice Age isn't truly over. We're living in an interglacial period, a warm phase between glacial periods. If natural climate cycles continue, another ice age will eventually come, though probably not for tens of thousands of years, and human-caused climate change might delay or prevent it. The ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica are remnants of the last ice age, frozen time capsules preserving ice that fell as snow when mammoths walked the Earth. Ice cores drilled from these ice sheets contain trapped air bubbles that tell us about past climate, about temperature and atmospheric composition going back hundreds of thousands of years. This is how we know about the Ice Age in such detail. Ancient ice preserves records that help us understand not just the past, but the present and future of climate. There's something poetic about that. The ice that tried to kill our ancestors now teaches us about their world. The frozen past informing the warming present. Time folded back on itself through careful science and human curiosity.
Embers and echoes. So, here we are, near the end of our long winter journey through the Ice Age. Let's settle in for these final thoughts as the fire burns low and the night stretches on. What must it have been like to live your entire life in that cold? To never experience what we'd consider a warm summer day? To watch your breath freeze in the air even inside your shelter? To feel the cold in your bones, a constant ache that never went away? The people of the Ice Age knew cold in a way we never will. Not really. Not even if we visit Antarctica or climb Everest. They lived in it. They were shaped by it. And yet, they persevered. They had children despite knowing those children might not survive. They created art despite having no guarantee anyone would see it. They cared for each other despite the burden it imposed. They laughed, loved, dreamed, hoped. They were human in all the ways we're human, facing different circumstances, but experiencing the same emotions, the same drives, the same essential humanity. The Ice Age lasted so long that people couldn't have conceived of it ending. It was the only world they knew, the only world their ancestors had known, stretching back into oral history until it disappeared into the mists of time. The idea that the world could be fundamentally different, that ice could retreat and warmth could return, was probably unimaginable. And yet, it happened. The world changed. Life adapted. Humans survived and eventually thrived. This gives me hope, actually. If humans could survive the Ice Age with nothing but stone tools and animal skins, if they could endure thousands of years of cold and scarcity and still create art, still tell stories, still love their children, then maybe we can face our current challenges. Climate change, resource depletion, conflict, disease, these are serious problems. But our ancestors faced problems at least as serious and found ways through. The difference is that we have advantages they didn't. We have accumulated knowledge, advanced technology, global communication. We can learn from the past, including the Ice Age. We can see the whole planet and understand systems in ways impossible for our ancestors. We can choose cooperation over competition, long-term thinking over short-term gain. Whether we will make those choices remains to be seen, but we have the capacity. We have the intelligence. We come from people who survived the unsurvivable. That legacy lives in us. The Ice Age also reminds us that stability is an illusion. The climate has always changed. Species have always gone extinct. Civilizations have risen and fallen. Nothing lasts forever. The world 20,000 years ago was completely different from the world today, and the world 20,000 years from now will be different again. This isn't depressing. It's liberating. If nothing is permanent, then our current problems aren't permanent either. But it also means our current comforts aren't permanent. It means we should appreciate what we have while we have it and prepare for change, because change is the only constant. The people of the Ice Age didn't have the luxury of assuming tomorrow would be like today. Every morning they woke up and had to figure out how to survive that day. They couldn't take anything for granted. Food, shelter, warmth, safety, all of these had to be actively maintained. This gave life an intensity and presence that most of us modern humans rarely experience. We're living in a world of abundance and stability. We assume we'll eat today because we ate yesterday. We assume we'll be safe because we were safe yesterday. We plan for the future, assuming the future will be similar to the present. This is a luxury that's only been possible for a tiny fraction of human history. But maybe we've lost something too. The Ice Age humans lived in the moment because the moment was all they had. They experienced life directly, viscerally. They knew hunger, cold, pain, but also the intense satisfaction of a successful hunt, the profound relief of finding shelter, the simple pleasure of warmth and food and companionship. We modern humans, with our comfortable lives and endless distractions, sometimes struggle to feel truly alive. We're disconnected from nature, from physical challenges, from immediate consequences. We experience life secondhand through screens. We're safer, healthier, more comfortable than any humans in history, and yet we're often anxious, depressed, unfulfilled. I'm not suggesting we should return to Ice Age conditions. That would be insane. But maybe there's a middle ground. Maybe we can find ways to engage more directly with life, to feel more connected to the physical world, to appreciate the abundance we have, while also challenging ourselves in meaningful ways. The Ice Age teaches us about what humans need, stripped down to essentials. We need food, water, shelter, warmth. We need social connection, purpose, challenge. We need to feel useful, to contribute, to matter to our group. We need stories, art, music, meaning. These are human universals, present in every culture, because they're essential to human well-being. Modern life provides the physical necessities easily, but sometimes fails at the psychological ones. We have food, but lack purpose. We have shelter, but lack community. We have safety, but lack challenge. We have entertainment, but lack meaning. The Ice Age humans had the opposite problem. They had purpose, community, challenge, and meaning in abundance. They just lacked basic physical security. Finding balance is the challenge. We can't and shouldn't go backwards, but we can learn from the past. We can create lives that satisfy both physical and psychological needs. We can build communities that provide both security and meaning. We can use technology wisely to enhance rather than replace human connection. As I think about those people huddled around fires 20,000 years ago, telling stories to pass the long nights, I feel a connection across time. They were us. We are them. The same hopes, fears, dreams, just different circumstances. They looked up at the same stars, wondered about the same questions, loved their families, feared death, hoped for better days. And those better days came eventually. The ice retreated, the world warmed. Their descendants, our ancestors, inherited a more hospitable world and built upon the foundations laid during those harsh millennia. Every innovation, every adaptation, every survival strategy developed during the Ice Age contributed to human success in the ages that followed. Agriculture wouldn't have been possible without the Ice Age. Humans learned patience, planning, and seasonal thinking during those long, cold years. We learned to store food, to prepare for hard times, to cooperate in large groups. These skills translated directly into early farming cultures. Civilization wouldn't have been possible without the Ice Age. The social structures, hierarchies, leadership patterns, division of labor, all of these started developing during the late Ice Age and continued evolving as the world warmed. Cities, states, empires,
These all built upon foundations laid by Ice Age hunter-gatherers. Technology wouldn't have been possible without the Ice Age. The careful observation of nature, the problem-solving, the tool-making, the passing down of knowledge, all of these began in the Ice Age and continued accelerating. Every tool we use today, from the simplest to the most complex, descends from stone tools knapped by Ice Age humans. Culture wouldn't exist without the Ice Age. Stories, art, music, religion, these all flourished during the Ice Age because humans needed them. We needed stories to teach survival skills. We needed art to express what words couldn't. We needed music to bond groups. We needed religion to make sense of a harsh and uncaring world. These aren't luxuries, they're necessities, as essential as food and shelter. The Ice Age proved that humans can survive almost anything if we work together, adapt creatively, and refuse to give up. This is our inheritance. This is who we are. Descendants of survivors, carrying within us the resilience, intelligence, and stubborn determination that got our ancestors through the worst conditions Earth has thrown at humanity. As the Ice Age finally released its grip and the world warmed into the Holocene, as forests expanded and animals flourished and humans spread across the globe, those who survived must have felt something we can only imagine. Relief, certainly. Hope, probably. Wonder at a world transformed. But also maybe a little sadness for those who hadn't lived to see the warming, for all the generations who suffered through the cold, believing it would never end. We owe them something, those Ice Age survivors. We owe them memory. We owe them respect. We owe them the effort to preserve what they helped create, this human civilization built on foundations they laid. We owe them the wisdom to learn from their struggles so we can face our own challenges with similar courage and determination.
The last watch of the night. We're in the final stretch now, so stay with me a bit longer as we watch these last embers glow in the darkness. The transition from Ice Age to modern climate didn't happen evenly everywhere. Some regions warmed quickly, while others remained cold for centuries longer. Some areas that had been habitable became uninhabitable as deserts expanded. Some areas that had been frozen wasteland became fertile and productive. The Sahara Desert, for instance, wasn't always a desert. During the African humid period from about 14,000 to 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was green, covered with grasslands and dotted with lakes. People lived there, herded animals, created rock art that still survives today. Then the climate shifted, the rains failed, and the desert returned. The people had to move or die. This kind of dramatic regional climate change happened repeatedly as the world transitioned out of the Ice Age. Sea levels rose dramatically as glaciers melted, drowning coastal areas and land bridges. Doggerland, the land connecting Britain to Europe, was gradually submerged, turning Britain into an island. The Bering Land Bridge flooded, separating Asia from North America. Coastal settlements were flooded, forcing people to relocate. These climate refugees, moving because their homes were literally underwater, faced the same challenges as any refugees: hostile reception from established groups, competition for resources, loss of homeland and identity. Some archaeologists think stories of great floods, common in many cultures worldwide, might be cultural memories of this post-Ice Age sea level rise. The biblical flood, the Epic of Gilgamesh, flood myths from dozens of cultures, these might preserve memories passed down through generations of when the seas rose and swallowed the land. Whether this is true or coincidence, we can't know. But it's interesting to consider that ancient myths might contain kernels of real environmental history. The warming climate also brought new diseases. Bacteria and viruses that have been dormant in frozen ground became active. Diseases from tropical and temperate zones spread into newly warmed northern regions. Human populations expanding into new areas encountered unfamiliar pathogens. Epidemics probably swept through populations with no immunity. This is speculation, but it's certain that disease played a role in post-Ice Age human history. The megafauna extinctions that occurred as the Ice Age ended were probably a combination of climate change and human hunting, but the exact proportion is still debated. Some species, like mammoths and mastodons, survived for thousands of years after the climate warmed, suggesting climate alone wasn't sufficient to kill them off. But they also tended to go extinct shortly after humans arrived in new regions, suggesting hunting was a factor. The truth is probably that climate change stressed these populations, reducing their habitat and food sources, and human hunting delivered the final blow to populations already struggling. Neither factor alone would have been sufficient, but together they were devastating. This is actually relevant today, as we face a similar situation with climate change and habitat destruction threatening many species. The combination is more dangerous than either threat alone. As forests expanded into former tundra, the ecosystem changed fundamentally. Animals adapted to open grasslands lost their habitat. Animals adapted to forests moved in. The mammoth steppe ecosystem, unique to the Ice Age, largely disappeared. This was a tragedy in terms of biodiversity, even though it made the world more hospitable for humans. Some scientists have proposed rewilding parts of Siberia to recreate the mammoth steppe ecosystem, using surviving species like musk oxen, bison, horses, and even, theoretically, de-extincting mammoths through genetic engineering. This is controversial and probably impractical, but it reflects recognition that we lost something valuable when that ecosystem disappeared. The development of agriculture, beginning around 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent and independently in other regions, fundamentally transformed human life. This is called the Neolithic Revolution, and it's when human history accelerated dramatically. Suddenly, within just a few thousand years, we went from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled farmers to urban civilizations. But agriculture came with costs. Farmers worked harder and longer hours than hunter-gatherers. Their diets were less diverse, leading to nutritional deficiencies. They lived in close proximity to animals, leading to new diseases. They created food surpluses that led to inequality and hierarchies. Population densities increased, leading to epidemic diseases that couldn't spread in small nomadic groups. Warfare intensified as agricultural land became valuable property worth fighting over. In many ways, early farmers were less healthy than their Ice Age hunter-gatherer ancestors. Skeletons from early agricultural societies show more signs of disease, malnutrition, and violence than Ice Age skeletons. Life expectancy might have actually decreased initially. But agriculture supported larger populations, and larger populations could outcompete smaller ones even if individuals were less healthy.
This is relevant to how we think about progress. Agriculture wasn't progress in the sense of making individual lives better. It was progress in the sense of supporting more people and enabling civilization. Sometimes what's good for the group isn't good for the individual. The Ice Age humans might have understood this better than we do. They made sacrifices for the group because the group's survival was everyone's survival. As human populations grew and spread during the post-Ice Age warming, groups diverged culturally and linguistically. The human family tree branched repeatedly. Different groups adapted to different environments, developed different technologies, told different stories. This diversity is one of humanity's great strengths. Different groups solved problems in different ways, and the best solutions spread through trade and contact. But diversity also led to conflict. Groups with different languages and cultures saw each other as foreign, threatening. Competition for resources led to warfare. The era of relatively peaceful coexistence, to the extent it existed during the Ice Age when populations were small and resources were poor, gave way to an era of conflict as populations grew and resources became worth fighting over. Still, trade and cooperation also increased. As groups specialized, they became interdependent. A group that made excellent pottery traded with a group that had good fishing grounds, who traded with a group that controlled a flint quarry. These trade networks became more extensive and complex over time. eventually connecting distant regions of the world. Writing, developed only about 5,000 years ago, is incredibly recent in the context of human history. Modern humans existed for 200,000 years before anyone invented writing. The entire Ice Age, all those thousands of years, no written records. All knowledge had to be memorized and passed down orally. This required incredible feats of memory that most modern people, dependent on written records and digital storage, can barely imagine. Oral cultures developed sophisticated mnemonic techniques. Stories, songs, and rituals helped people remember important information. Elders who could remember tribal history and knowledge were invaluable. The invention of writing changed this, externalizing memory and allowing knowledge to accumulate in ways impossible before. But writing also changed how people think. Oral cultures think differently than literate cultures. They prioritize different things, structure information differently. We've lost some of that oral culture's strengths, even as we've gained literacy's advantages. The Ice Age people, relying entirely on oral tradition, probably had cognitive skills we lack and would struggle to develop. The last few thousand years of human history, from the invention of writing to the present, are extraordinary in terms of technological and social change. We've gone from stone tools to smartphones, from nomadic bands to global civilization, from oral tradition to the internet. The pace of change has accelerated exponentially. But biologically, we're still Ice Age humans. Our bodies and brains evolved for that environment and haven't changed significantly. We're Stone Age minds in a Space Age world, and this mismatch causes many modern problems. Our instincts and intuitions, honed for Ice Age survival, don't always serve us well in modern contexts. We crave sugar and fat because they were scarce and valuable during the Ice Age. Now they're abundant and we overeat. We're suspicious of outsiders because strangers were potentially dangerous during the Ice Age. Now we live in diverse global societies and xenophobia causes conflict. We're bad at thinking long-term because during the Ice Age, the future was uncertain and immediate survival was paramount. Now we need to think decades and centuries ahead to address climate change and sustainability. Understanding our Ice Age origins helps us understand ourselves. We can recognize which of our tendencies are useful adaptations and which are outdated instincts. We can work to overcome our limitations and build on our strengths. We're not prisoners of our evolutionary past, but we can't ignore it either. As we sit here at the end of this long journey through the Ice Age, I hope you've gained some appreciation for what our ancestors endured and achieved. They weren't primitive. They weren't simple. They were us, facing different challenges with the same human intelligence, emotion, and will to survive. Every time you feel warm on a cold day, think of them. Every time you have a full meal, think of them. Every time you're safe and comfortable, think of them. Everything we have, everything we are, is built on the foundation they created during those long, cold millennia. The Ice Age ended roughly 12,000 years ago, but its legacy continues. It shaped our species, our cultures, our psychology. It proved that humans can adapt to almost anything. It showed that cooperation and creativity are humanity's greatest strengths. It demonstrated that even in the darkest, coldest times, humans find reasons to keep going. And here we are, descendants of those survivors, facing our own challenges in a rapidly changing world. We have advantages they never dreamed of, but we also have problems they never faced. Can we show the same resilience, the same adaptability, the same stubborn refusal to give up that got our ancestors through the Ice Age? I think we can. I think we must, because giving up isn't an option, not for individuals and not for our species. The people who lived through the Ice Age didn't have the option to give up. They kept going because the alternative was death. We're in a similar situation now, though our threats are different. Climate change, ecological destruction, resource depletion, these are existential challenges. But unlike our Ice Age ancestors, we can see these challenges coming. We can understand them. We can choose to act. We have the knowledge and technology to solve these problems if we have the will. The question is whether we'll make the hard choices, accept short-term sacrifices for long-term survival, cooperate globally instead of competing locally. Our Ice Age ancestors would probably tell us we're crazy to even hesitate. They would have given anything for the resources and knowledge we have. They survived despite having almost nothing. We have everything and are debating whether to use it to save ourselves.
The fire burns low. The night is nearly over. The fire has burned down to coals, glowing faintly in the darkness. In a few hours, dawn will come, bringing another day in our modern world, so different from the Ice Age world we've been exploring. But before we go, let's sit quietly for a moment and imagine one more time. Imagine a group of people, 20,000 years ago, gathered around their fire as night falls. The wind howls outside their shelter. Snow falls steadily. Somewhere in the darkness, a wolf howls. The children are asleep, bundled in furs. The adults are tired from the day's work, but not ready to sleep yet. Someone starts telling a story, a familiar one, about a great hunt, about a clever hunter who outsmarted a mammoth. The listeners have heard it before, but still enjoy it. Someone else hums a tune, tapping a rhythm on a hollow bone. Someone else works on a tool, carefully shaping stone in the firelight. These are our ancestors. These are real people who lived and loved and suffered and survived. Their lives were hard in ways we can barely imagine, but they were lives full of meaning, purpose, and connection. They didn't have what we have, but they had each other. They had their group, their family, their fire. And somehow, impossibly, they endured. And because they endured, we're here. Every single one of us is descended from people who made it through. That's something to remember when things get hard. We come from survivors. We carry their strength within us. We're the continuation of their story, the inheritors of their struggle. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, warm and safe and fed, spare a thought for those ancient people huddled in the cold. Thank them silently for their perseverance. Acknowledge the debt we owe them, and maybe promise to honor their legacy by facing our own challenges with similar courage. The Ice Age is over. The long winter finally ended. But the human story continues, each generation building on what came before, each of us adding our small part to this ongoing saga. We're the inheritors of an incredible legacy, and we're the ancestors of those who will come after us. What kind of ancestors will we be? What kind of world will we leave? These are questions worth pondering as the night grows late and the fire burns low. Sleep well, friends. Dream of times long past when the world was cold and survival was uncertain, but humans persevered anyway. Dream of your ancestors gathering around fires, telling stories, making tools, planning for tomorrow. Dream of the long chain of survival stretching back through the generations, each link essential, each life precious, all of it leading here, to you. And when you wake, remember, you're descended from people who survived the Ice Age. Whatever challenges you face, you carry their strength within you. Use it wisely. Use it well. The night is ending. The story is told. The Ice Age is just a memory now, preserved in bones and tools and paintings, and the DNA we all carry. But its lessons remain relevant. Adaptability, cooperation, perseverance, creativity, community. These are the keys to survival then and now. Thank you for joining me on this long journey through deep time. Thank you for listening as we explored what life was like when winter never ended and humans survived through intelligence, determination, and an unwillingness to give up, even when giving up seemed like the sensible thing to do. Rest now. Tomorrow is another day, another chance to honor the legacy of those who came before by living well, treating each other with kindness, and working together to face whatever challenges arise. The fire is just embers now. The darkness is deep, but dawn always comes eventually. Our ancestors understood that. They lived through the longest winter in human history and emerged into the light of a new age. We can too. Good night.